Welcome to Using IDIS for the HOPWA Formula Grant Program. This webinar is designed for the experienced HOPWA formula user to provide an overview of enhancements made to IDIS. My name is Amy Richter, and I am the Project Manager for the National HOPWA Data Verification Project at Collaborative Solutions, Inc. We are a HUD technical assistance provider contracted by the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing to provide training and ongoing assistance on performance reporting and on IDIS to HOPWA grantees. On the left side of your screen, you will see several documents related to this webinar for you to download. Please download them now. They include several reference documents to help you better understand and to practice the concepts I will be discussing today, a copy of the presentation for you to take notes on, and tools to help you implement your grant in IDIS. Today, we will first review the enhancements made to the HOPWA pathway in IDIS. Next, we will go over some key definitions. The bulk of our time will be spent demonstrating how to implement these enhancements in the User Acceptance Testing, or UAT server. The UAT server mimics IDIS production, but will not affect any grantees' actual HOPWA dollars. And finally, we will introduce the transition tool provided for you in the IDIS user manual as Appendix D. This tool is designed to help you identify and to implement any changes you may need to make to accommodate the new IDIS enhancements. In November 2011, the first release of IDIS enhancements went live for the formula program. In May 2012, HUD released the Using IDIS online for the HOPWA program manual to provide training and guidance for all users. These enhancements and the accompanying guidance really focus on four major updates. First, as many of you know, consolidated planning has been integrated into IDIS as the Econ Planning Suite. The Econ Planning Suite will allow formula users to complete consolidated plan and annual action plans electronically in IDIS. This system includes many new tools and features that allow for better planning and reporting in each community. The goal for the HOPWA program was to integrate your performance reporting fully into IDIS so that there's a link between goals your community sets during the planning process and reporting the outcomes you achieve at the end of your operating year. Eventually, this will allow the HOPWA program to eliminate the paper-based CAPER report in favor of electronic performance reporting. Across all CPD programs, the new IDIS screens include several questions to better track adherence to the lead-based paint requirements outlined in Title 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 35. The enhancements also created another program pathway in IDIS called HOPWA-C. You have probably already noticed the new HOPWA-C pathway. This pathway will allow HOPWA competitive grantees to transition into IDIS. Formula grantees should continue to use the HOPWA pathway to enter in projects and activities and should not enter any projects or activities in the HOPWA-C pathway. Finally, over the last several months of working with HOPWA grantees, we have discovered that there is very little consistency in how users across the country have been setting up projects and activities in IDIS. Grantees have been working with older guidance and trying to best apply this old guidance to current systems. As a result, each HUD field office has not had a consistent way to monitor IDIS entries across grantees. The user manual and the IDIS enhancements establish a fairly consistent structure for formula grantees to use. What this also means is that some grantees will have to implement changes in the way they enter their HOPWA program into IDIS. HUD understands that this may be challenging for some grantees, and as a result, they are trying to ensure that all grantees get technical assistance and support as they transition these changes into their systems. Throughout this presentation, I will try to point out areas where grantees may need to implement changes. Also, at the end of this training, you will find a list of technical assistance resources as well as my contact information. Do not hesitate to contact any of us after this webinar if you have questions and concerns about what these changes mean for you. Now we are going to start talking about some key definitions. These definitions may slightly alter how some grantees have been implementing IDIS. If you get confused, remember these definitions also appear in your user manual. Projects are the organizations implementing the HOPWA grant. This includes both project sponsors and the grantee. At any given time, there should be one and no more than one active project for every project sponsor and one for the grantee. I want to highlight this because this is one place where the new structure may differ slightly from how some formula grantees have been establishing projects. If you have not been setting up projects for all of your project sponsors, you will now need to do so. If you have been setting up multiple projects for your project sponsors during the operating year based on which grant you fund them from, you will be now setting up only one project for the entire operating year, regardless of how you fund activities for the project sponsor. Since subrecipients are contracted to carry out duties on behalf of either the grantee or the project sponsor, they are not considered separate projects. Subrecipient information will be reported elsewhere. This year, you will need to create a project for yourself and all of your project sponsors. But once a project is created, it can be copied and updated in following years. This will cut down on data entry for future accomplishment years. Activities are associated with a specific project. There are now two types of activities in IDIS. The first are activities created to fund eligible services and are the activities formula grantees are most familiar with using. There are some notable changes to these activities, however. First, within each activity, you may establish multiple accomplishment years. For grantees that use the same HUD allocation to fund multiple contract years for a project sponsor, users can now use the same activity by setting up multiple accomplishment years. I will demonstrate how to use this feature later on in the webinar. Second, the new screens will allow you to report annual targets and performance in IDIS, and eventually will eliminate the paper caper. And as previously mentioned, there is now a place within the activity to report the names of subrecipients contracted out either by the grantee or project sponsor to assist with duties. This could include, for example, a contractor who does habitability inspections for a TBRA program, or an administrative agent who acts on behalf of the grantee. The second type of activities are new in IDIS. They were created primarily for reporting purposes and are not associated with any HOPWA funds. We call these activities simply the reporting activities. They were created to allow you to report performance across activities and to maintain your current data collection systems. These are the different types of activities available in IDIS. The first column on this slide details the services activities. These you should be familiar with. They remained primarily the same. Please note, however, two slight differences. Facility-based housing subsidy assistance used to be labeled operations. This change was made to keep terminology in line with the current CAPER system. Administration. IDIS will now only allow one administration activity to be set up for each project. You will set up one administration activity for the grantee project. This should include administration costs for all activities and should not be budgeted for more than 3% of the total grant cost. You will also set up one administration activity for each of the projects established for your project sponsors. This should include administration costs for up to 7% of the total grant cost awarded to the project sponsor. Please note this is another place where formula grantees may need to implement changes in IDIS. If you have been setting up more than one administration activity per project, you will no longer be allowed to do so in IDIS. There are also now 3 reporting activities. There is no funding associated with any of these activities. These activities should be set up after you complete setup for direct services activities, and I will demonstrate this in UAT later on. The first is the project sponsor reporting activity. This activity will be used to report agency-wide targets and accomplishments, such as leveraged resources for each project sponsor. The user will establish one project sponsor reporting activity for every project created for a project sponsor. This activity will also be used to adjust for duplication for households that received more than one housing subsidy assistance from the same project sponsor. For example, a household received Strum U at the beginning of the year, but could not maintain the household expenses and received a TBRA voucher at the end of the year from the same project sponsor. The second reporting activity is the grantee reporting activity. This activity will be used to report agency or jurisdiction-wide targets and accomplishments, such as unmet need or grantee leveraged resources. There should be one grantee reporting activity associated with the project established for the grantee. It will also be used to report jurisdiction-wide beneficiary data and access to care data. The system will allow the grantee to continue using current data collection methods for beneficiary data and access to care data, and to report it in IDIS in aggregate as it is currently reported in the HOPWA caper. If the grantee is also providing direct services, the grantee should have both a project sponsor and a grantee reporting activity set up. The last reporting activity is the stewardship certification. This activity should be used to certify that units acquired, developed, or rehabbed with HOPWA funds are still meeting terms of usage as required in Title 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 574.310. Additional key definitions describe time periods associated with the grant award. Grant year is the fiscal allocation year associated with the HOPWA grant awarded by HUD. This is essentially the year or years of HUD grants you have been awarded and are using to fund activities. Program year is the grant year being used to fund active projects and activities in IDIS. Because formula grantees have multiple years to spend a single grant year, the program year may not equal the actual grant year used to fund a specific activity. In fact, the grantee may be using more than one grant year to fund activities, but in IDIS, you will identify a single program year. We will discuss this in depth throughout the webinar. You can also read about choosing a program year in handout number 3, available for download now. Please note, this is another area where grantees may need to make a change. Accomplishment year is the 12-month period for which activities will operate services according to the consolidated plan. Accomplishment year is the 12-month period you currently provide performance data on in your caper. This slide depicts how IDIS uses grant year, program year, and accomplishment year to track your grant. Projects are identified and stored in this system specifically by their project title, the project ID number, which is generated automatically by IDIS when you set up a project, and the single program year you choose for all of your projects and activities. As a reminder, for each project you set up, you will need to keep a record of the project title, project ID, and program year. There is a sample tracking tool provided for you in the appendix section of your manual, and an Excel version available for download. Within a project, you will also be asked to write a short narrative describing the project and to provide an agency-wide estimated budget that includes projected program income. Activities are identified and stored in IDIS by their activity title, the system-generated activity number, and the program year you assign to all of your projects and activities. You will want to keep track of these numbers also for use throughout the year using the sample tracking tool provided. Also, within each activity, you will be asked to identify an accomplishment year. Once you choose an accomplishment year, you will establish targets, complete drawdowns, and report performance for that accomplishment year. Finally, you will also attach, or what we call encumber funding, to each activity by amount and by the grant year or years. Putting it all together, visually, the structure looks like this. The grantee owns all projects and activities in the system. In this way, the system can tell which project sponsors work on behalf of a specific grantee. The grantee will establish a project for itself and one for each of its project sponsors. Each project will be identified in the system by a single program year. Under each project, the grantee will associate activities also identified by the same program year. The mix of activities you set up should match those established in your consolidated plan and your annual action plan. There will most likely be multiple activities associated with each project. For the project sponsor, activities will include HOPWA-eligible services to be implemented by the agency, agency administration, and a project sponsor reporting activity. For the grantee, activities will include HOPWA-eligible services provided by the grantee administration, and a grantee reporting activity. Grantees who provide direct services for clients will also have a project sponsor reporting activity associated with it. Within each activity, the grantee may use multiple grant years to fund activities. However, all activities will be associated to a single program year. For this reason, it is possible to use the same set of projects and activities for multiple accomplishment years. To determine this at the start of each accomplishment year, you will need to decide for your jurisdiction whether the same agencies will be providing services, whether the same mix of services will be provided, and whether projects and activities will be assigned to the same program year. If the answer to these questions is yes, then the grantee can add another accomplishment year to already established activities. If this is confusing, do not worry. I will demonstrate this in UAT. Additionally, this is detailed in your user manual available for download now. Before I start the demonstration in UAT, I want to again point out materials available for you to download. First is the Using IDIS for HOPWA Program Manual. This manual details everything I am demonstrating to you today, including the complex definitions we have discussed. There are 4 handouts. The first gives guidelines on setting up and naming projects. The second gives guidelines on setting up and naming activities. The third describes how to choose a single program year. And the fourth handout details some glitches grantees have noted in IDIS since the enhancements went live and steps to work around these glitches. Although HUD is working to correct these glitches, the process may take some time. So please keep this sheet with your manual as a reference tool. I am basing my demonstration today on the 2 exercises also available for you to download. If you wish to follow along with what I am doing, please feel free to use these exercise sheets. You may also use these exercise sheets to practice concepts we discussed today in the UAT server. Finally, the transition tool for formula grantees that we discuss later is available for download. This tool also appears as Appendix D in your user manual. This is the scenario I will be using to demonstrate projects and activities today. The grantee is the state of New Mexico. Please note that although the state of New Mexico is a HOPWA formula grantee, the scenario presented is fictional and in no way represents the implementation of the HOPWA grant in New Mexico. In this scenario, the grantee in New Mexico has one project sponsor, the Southwest Housing Corporation, or SHC, who has 2 activities: tenant-based rental assistance at $500,000 and agency administration at 7% or $33,950. This project will also have a project sponsor reporting activity associated with it. The state will retain $15,000 for administration and will have a grantee reporting activity associated with it. I'm now going to switch to the demonstration mode. This is the login screen for IDIS. At the top of the screen, you will see how the click here for logging into IDIS production. If you keep scrolling down to the bottom, you will see the login screen for UAT. Once you've signed in, you will be taken to the disclaimer page. You will notice that UAT looks exactly like production except for it says UAT at the top. Read the disclaimer and hit I accept. Now this page is in UAT only. You will not see this in production. The next screen that you will see when you log into IDIS or UAT is your news screen. This is your main navigation page. From the top, the tabs should look familiar to you: plans, projects and activities, funding and drawdown, grants, grantee and PJ, admin, and reports. The first thing we're going to do is set up our projects. To do that, we're going to click on Plans, Projects, and Activities. It automatically defaults to the Search Activity screen, so to set up a project, I'm going to go to the navigation on the left side of my screen and hit Add under Project. You'll notice the Add Project screen comes up, indicating that the grantee is New Mexico. The first thing I need to do is establish my program year that I will be using for all of my projects and activities. First, if as the grantee you generally use a single grant year to fund activities, the grant year and the program year may be the same. But if you tend to fund activities for your project sponsors using multiple grant years, you can use one of several options to choose program year. The important thing is to choose one methodology and use it consistently from year to year. First, if the bulk of your activities will be funded from a single grant year, you may align your program year with that particular grant year. So, for example, if you plan to use grant years 2011 and 2012 to fund activities, but 3/4 of your activities will be funded from grant year 2012, you may choose 2012 as your program year. Second, you may decide to use the earliest grant year funding activities as the program year. Remember, this may be helpful if you plan to set up multi-year contracts with your project sponsors using the same grant year. Using the same scenario where activities were funded from both grant year 2011 and 2012, 2011 would be the earliest grant year. In this example, you may end up setting up multiple accomplishment years within your activities, if 2011 is the earliest grant year funding multiple accomplishment years. Finally, if you have a logical sequence that has worked for you over the history of your formula grant, you may continue to use the next logical program year in that. In this example, the grantee has received formula funds and plans to use grant years 2011 and 2012. Last year, the grantee labeled activities as program year 2012, so I'm going to use the next logical year in the sequence, 2012. Handout 1 gives you naming conventions for projects. It includes the program year you've chosen, the name of the organization, the full name, and in this case, I'm going to use the project sponsor, Southwest Housing Corporation, and I'm going to include any abbreviations that I may use while I'm setting up activities. Grantee/PJ project ID is not used by the HOPWA program. This is an optional field for grantees. You may leave it blank, or some grantees choose to use it to track internal contract numbers. Next, you're going to enter a description to the agency, It should be enough, however, to let HUD know what the project is intended to do. Underneath that, you will see two options. Allow another organization to set up activities under this project. This feature has actually been disabled for the HOPWA program. It will allow you to select an organization, but it will not allow you to save it. So you want to go ahead and skip that feature. The next one is assign a sponsor for this project, only for HOPWA or HOPWA-C programs. This is required for every project that you establish for a project sponsor organization. You must attach an agency name if the project is being established for a project sponsor organization. You would do this by hitting the button, Select Sponsor Organization, and you will come up to a search criteria screen. Once an agency has been entered, it is retained in the system, and you will not have to enter it in the next year. If you do need to add an organization, you hit the Add Organization button, enter in the address and organization name, the DUNS number and EIN number, contact information, and you would save it. I'm going to cancel out for brevity. I've already entered in Southwest Housing Corporation. If possible, you would always want to search by the EIN number. That way, if an organization has been incorrectly entered twice, you would be able to pick that up right away. Once the organization comes up, you click the dial next to it to highlight it, and then hit Select. You'll be redirected back to the Add Project screen, and you'll notice that now Southwest Housing Corporation has been added as a project sponsor. You can only attach one agency for every project. That's because you should have an active project for every project sponsor organization. You can change the sponsor organization or you can remove, but you cannot add a second one. This Add Project table is common for all CPD programs, so you're going to go down to estimated amounts, including program income, and you're going to enter the entire HOPWA amount for the program. In this case, it's $500,000, and we do not expect to have any program income. You'll notice once I click off the line, it's automatically populated in the total. And I'm going to hit Save. I'll know that I've been successful when I get the success message at the top of the screen. If you receive an error message and you're unable to save your project, the user manual has a troubleshooting section. Refer to the manual. It will help you to resolve if you get an error message. So I've established my project for the project sponsor, and I still need to establish my project for the grantee. So I'm going to go back to the left side of my screen under Project and hit Add. And I'm taken back to the Add Project screen. I check that my grantee name is correct, and I'm going to choose the same program year, 2012, that I selected for my project sponsor, and use my naming convention. Typing in the full name, and then any abbreviation I plan to use when I'm setting up activities. The grantee project ID screen is optional. I type in my description, and I scroll down. Now, I do not need to use the assigned sponsor for this project while I'm setting up this particular project because it's for the grantee. Remember, that is required for every project sponsor organization project, but not for the grantee. Instead, I'm going to scroll down to the estimated amount, and under HOPWA, I'm going to enter in that the grantee is retaining $15,000 for administration, and I hit Save. And the project has been successfully saved. Now that I've entered in my two projects, I want to set up activities for these projects. I'm always going to start with my direct services activities. So I'm going to start by entering in the TBRA activity for the project sponsor. To do that, I go to the left side of my screen, and under Activity, I click on Add. And I'm waiting for the Add Activity screen to come up. Once the screen has fully loaded, I'm going to double check that I am the activity owner. I'm going to select the program year. Remember, this is the same program year I set up all of my projects with. And it's going to take a second because what the system is doing is automatically populating the next drop-down with the projects that I have set up for the year. So under IDIS Project ID and Project Title, I'm going to hit the arrow button and choose the Southwest Housing Corporation. I'm going to make sure that on my tracking sheet, I have listed my 2 project IDs. So for Southwest Housing, my project ID is 8, and for the grantee, my project ID is number 9. Handout number 2 will give you the naming conventions for activities. I'm going to list the grant years this time that I'm using to fund this service. I can use the abbreviation for the organization that I established in the project title and the type of activity that I'm setting up. This Add Activity screen is common across CPD programs. So there's some fields that are common that you will have to complete. The first is environmental assessment. You will have to indicate for every activity whether the environmental assessment was completed, exempt, or is underway. Remember, HOPWA does not allow you to attach another organization to access this activity, so you can ignore that field. And you're going to add an activity description. There are conventions for this in your manual. I'm going to give enough information that if HUD opens up the activity, they understand exactly who I'm trying to serve and what service will be provided. I'm going to scroll back up to the table labeled Activity, and I'm going to be sure to go to the row labeled HOPWA. And in the drop-down box, I am going to choose what type of activity this is. Both your services and your reporting activities should appear in this drop-down. So I'm going to go to TBRA and highlight that. And you'll see 2 columns, Ready to Fund and Setup Detail. Ready to Fund will not switch to yes until you've completed your setup detail. So I'm going to hit Add HOPWA. At this point, the system has generated my activity ID number. So I'm going to go into this gray field and make sure that all of the information listed here is correct. And I am going to write down in my tracking sheet my activity ID number, which is 8038. The first thing you're going to be asked to do, and you do this at the beginning of the year, is establish what accomplishment year you are setting targets for. In the setup field, you are going to be setting your goals for the accomplishment year. This information would generally have appeared in your paper in Part 3, Table 1. So the first thing it's going to ask me is the budget for this activity. You will notice a line that says Budget for Other Rental Assistance Activities as Approved. You can ignore this line. This was put in there primarily for special projects of national significance. There has been a history of approving shallow rental subsidies. Currently, no one is approved for that, so you can leave that blank. And you're going to enter the proposed households to be served with TBRA. And in this case, I'm going to say 30 households. And scroll down and enter the proposed households to be served with leveraged TBRA. And I'm going to enter 20. It is here within the activity that you would identify any subrecipients. A subrecipient, for example, could be an organization hired to do habitability inspections for TBRA participants. I would choose a subrecipient by hitting Select Organization, and again, it takes me to a screen similar to assigning a sponsor for a project, where I'm asked for search criteria for an organization. I'm going to enter as much information as I have. If I don't have any, I can hit search, and every organization that has been listed for my region will come up. So I'm going to choose one and hit select. Scrolling down, you'll see that this organization, the Albuquerque Healthcare Coalition, has now been assigned as a subrecipient. Unlike establishing a sponsor for a project sponsor organization, you can assign multiple subrecipients to an activity. We're just going to leave that one right now. Next, you're going to be asked to choose a performance objective and a performance outcome. These should align to what you have established in your consolidated plan. They default to provide decent, affordable housing and affordability. So I'm going to leave that there. And the last thing I'm going to do is enter the address. For TBRA, the address is going to be your administrative offices. If you are establishing activities for facility-based housing programs, you're going to set up separate activities for every facility, regardless of whether they're for the same project sponsor. You would enter a single facility address for each activity. This information may be used for mapping purposes for the consolidated plan. If this is an address where clients reside and you would like it to remain confidential, be sure to click off the confidential button. And I'm going to show you what happens if you enter an address. You need to enter in at least the street address and the state and city and validate this address. You'll know it's been successful because next to address you'll get a green check mark, and if you scroll over it, you'll get census information about the address. Once I've done this, I'm going to hit save. The system may take a minute to save correctly. I'll know it's been successful when I get the success message at the top and I'm taken back to the Edit Activity page. Once the page is fully loaded, I should be able to scroll down, and now next to TBRA, I see that the activity is ready to fund. So I have two more direct service activities to set up. Both are administration activities, one for the project sponsor and one for the grantee. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to the left of my screen and under activity, hitting add. Remember, the add activity screen can take a second to come up. I'm going to check to make sure that I'm listed as the activity owner. I'm going to select the same program year I've been setting up all of my projects and activities for, and wait for the next screen, project ID and project title, to populate. And I'm going to scroll down to my project sponsor activity number 8. I'm going to use my naming convention, and this time I'm going to say that I'm solely using 2012 to fund this service. I can use my agency abbreviation, and I indicate what type of activity it is. I scroll down and indicate that environmental assessment is exempt, and I would write my agency description here. I scroll up to HOPWA, hit the drop down, and this time I'm going to indicate that this is an administration activity. I'm going to go over to the column labeled Setup Detail and hit Add HOPWA. I'm going to check my gray box to make sure that all of the information that I've provided is correct, and I'm going to mark down on my tracking sheet that this is activity 8039. I enter my accomplishment year, making sure it's the same accomplishment year I used for TBRA. And I'm going to enter my grantee budget for administration for the accomplishment year. If the project sponsor has any subrecipients attached, then you would attach the project sponsor subrecipient here and hit Save. Budget is the only target you have to set for administration. I wait for it to take me to my Edit Activity page. I check to make sure I have my success message, and once the page has fully loaded, I'm going to check to make sure that it now says Ready to Fund. And the last direct service activity I need to set up is my administration for my grantee. So I'm going to hit Activity. Under that, I'm going to hit Add, and wait for the Add Activity screen to come up. And I'm going to use the same procedures that I used to establish the project sponsor administration activity, only this time I'm going to enter the budget for the grantee. So I check to make sure my activity owner is correct. I select the same program year I've been using all along. I wait for project ID and project title to populate, and then choose the grantee this time from the drop-down box, and that's project number 9, and I make sure that that's correct. I use my naming convention to label the activity. I make sure that I click off exempt for environmental assessments and that I write an appropriate activity description. And again, consult your user manual for guidelines on your description. Under the row labeled HOPWA, I'm going to make sure to highlight administration activity. I go over to Setup Detail and click Add HOPWA. I review my gray area to make sure I've clicked off the grantee, that this is an administration activity, and I write down that it's activity ID number 8040. I use my same accomplishment year that I've been using all along, and I enter the budget for the grantee. If you use an administrative agent as the grantee to cover remote parts of your jurisdictions or different states, and they're acting on behalf of the grantee, setting up contracts and possibly getting part of your 3% administration cost, it is here that you would identify them as a subrecipient. In this case, I'm going to leave it blank and hit Save. And I'm waiting for it to take me back to the Edit Activity Navigation page. I check to make sure I have my success message. And once the page is fully loaded, I'm going to scroll down and make sure that it's listed as Ready to Fund. So now I've set up all of my direct service activities. The next step is to set up my project sponsor reporting activities. So I need to set up one project sponsor reporting activity to associate to the Southwest Housing Corporation. And I use the same procedure that I use to set up my services activities. So I go to the left side of the screen under Activity and hit Add, and wait till it takes me to the Add Activity page. I check to make sure the activity owner is correct. I select the same program year I've been using all along, and I wait for IDIS project ID, project title to populate. I hit the drop-down and make sure, since this is a project sponsor reporting activity, that I hit the project sponsor. I'm going to use my naming convention. However, since this is a zero-funded activity, I'm going to use my program year. I'm going to use my abbreviation. I'm going to indicate this is the project sponsor reporting activity. Project sponsor reporting is exempt from environmental assessment, and I would write my agency description here. Going back up to the HOPWA row, I click the drop-down box, and this time I want to highlight project sponsor reporting. I go over to the column labeled Setup Detail and hit Add HOPWA. I'm going to check my gray area, making sure that this is the correct project sponsor, that I have the correct project name, and I'm going to write down that my project sponsor reporting activity is ID number 8041. This screen looks a little different. What I'm going to need to do is enter my accomplishment year using the same accomplishment year I've been using all along, and hit Save. Once I hit save, if I scroll down, additional tables will appear. The reason that you have to hit save first is that this table automatically populates from information I entered in my direct services activities. So I must tell the system first what accomplishment year to pull from. This table is labeled Housing Subsidy Assistance Target Goal Adjustment for Duplication. And in this case, it's pulled information for my TBRA activity, indicating that I intend to serve 30 households with HOPWA funds and 20 households with leveraged funds. It will total all of the housing subsidy assistance activities you have entered for this particular project sponsor. The only data entry field is this one here, Goal Adjustments for households that received more than one type of housing subsidy assistance from the same project sponsor. An example would be a project sponsor who receives permanent housing placement to pay first month's rent for clients who are moving into TBRA. In this case, if you had a program where there was a duplication where 5 clients got security deposit money before moving into a TBRA program, I would enter 5 here. And when I click off the row, you'll notice that 5 has automatically been subtracted from the bottom line total. This gives me an unduplicated target household count for every project sponsor. Once I've done that, I'm going to hit save. If you have no projected adjustment for duplication, you can leave those lines blank. However, you would still want to set up your project sponsor reporting activity for your project sponsors. And I have my success message. Once the page is finished loading, if I scroll down under Ready to Fund, it's going to say no. And the reason is because all reporting activities are not associated with any funding. You do not have to encumber any funds to these activities. So now that I've established my project sponsor reporting activity, the next thing I need to do is establish my grantee reporting activity. You should always set up your activities in this order: direct services activities, project sponsor activity, and then finally your grantee reporting activity. You do this by, again, going over to the left of your screen and under Activity, hitting Add. And waiting for the Add Activity screen to come up. I'm going to check to make sure that I'm listed as the activity owner. I'm going to use the same program year I've been using all along and wait for project ID and project title to populate. Excuse me. Under project ID and project title, this time I'm going to be sure to hit project number 9 that I've established for the grantee. I'm going to use my activity naming convention. I'm going to indicate that environmental assessment is exempt, and I would write my activity description. For the grantee, and again, there are guidelines in your manual, you're going to be sure to enter any information about your unmet need, about jurisdiction-wide distribution of funds, anything that would normally appear in your CAPR. I'm going to go up to HOPWA. I'm going to highlight grantee reporting underneath the activity category line in the row labeled HOPWA. And under Setup Detail, I'm going to hit Add HOPWA. And again, I'm going to check my gray box, make sure that I have checked off the grantee as the owner, that it's the project for the grantee, and I'm going to write down on my tracking sheet that it's activity ID number 8042. And like the project sponsor reporting activity, I'm going to need to enter an accomplishment year and hit Save before additional questions will populate. You'll see a table that looks very similar. It's titled Housing Subsidy Assistance, Target Goal Adjustment for Duplication. This table is actually going to populate from all of your project sponsor reporting activities. This is why you're going to do the grantee reporting activity last. So it populated for my example that I had 30 households projected to be assisted with HOPWA funds, 20 with leverage, that there is adjustment for duplication for 5 households that received more than one type of housing subsidy assistance from the same project sponsor. The only data entry field here is a goal adjustment for duplication between project sponsors. An example of this would be you have 2 organizations that are both project sponsors, and they work together. One provides permanent housing placements, providing security deposits and application fees for households that will be moving into TBRA. And a second organization actually provides the TBRA service. And I would enter my adjustment for duplication here, and similarly, it has subtracted from the total bottom line. This is giving me an unduplicated count across my jurisdiction for households that I am proposing to serve with housing subsidy assistance, and the same with leveraged funds. The next screen is very similar. It's an adjustment for duplication between project sponsors for supportive services. The actual supportive service adjustment for duplication for services from the same project sponsor occurs within the supportive service activity itself. And that's why you didn't see it in the project sponsor reporting activity. And since we're not establishing a supportive services activity today, it won't be part of this demonstration. However, your user manual has set up details for every single type of activity. If you need to set up a HOPWA supportive services activity, please consult your manual for further detail. And the last thing you're going to do is establish your unmet need for the jurisdiction. And I'm going to enter my numbers in the table. And you'll notice once I click off, the total unmet need is automatically populated by adding up my rows. And finally, I'm going to click off what data sources I use to establish my unmet need. And this should mirror what you put in your consolidated plan. And I'm going to hit Save. The system is going to take me back to the Edit Activity Navigation page. And I have my success message. Once the page is fully loaded, if I scroll down to activity funding or to the activity table, I should again see that it is not ready to fund because this is a zero funded activity. There are 2 ways that you can encumber funds to your service activities. And now that I've set up all of my projects and activities, I'm ready to encumber or associate funding to my activities. I can do this in one of 2 ways. The first is I can click directly on the Funding Drawdown tab at the top of my page and search Activity Funding. And the second way is through the Plans, Projects, and Activities page. And this is probably the way you'll use more often. You can, as soon as the project is ready to fund, you can associate funds to it. So you can do that while you're setting up your direct services activities. So I'm going to search, and this is where it comes in handy to know my activity ID numbers, and I'm going to do TBRA for the project sponsor. Once the activity has come up under Action, I'm going to hit Edit. And wait for the system to take me to the Edit Activity Navigation page that you should be familiar with at this point. Once the page is fully loaded, I'm going to scroll down to the Activity table. And you'll notice there's now a button that's active that says Activity Funding. If I hit that, it's going to take me automatically to the Funding Drawdown page, and it's automatically going to have me associated with Activity ID number 8038 for TBRA for the project sponsor. And I'm going to be able to see my entire grant and the amount available for funding. Under Action, I'm going to hit Add Edit. Again, double checking I'm in the correct activity. And I'm going to enter the grant years that I'm using to fund this activity. So I'm going to say 1,000 is coming from grant year 2011, And I'm going to hit Add Grant Year, and this is how I fund for multiple grant years. So now I'm going to tell it that I want to fund the bulk of this activity from my 2012 grant. So I've got 2 funding years funding this activity, and I'm going to hit Save. If you get an error message, again, consult your manual. And this is an example of an error message. I've exceeded the amount available for funding. So I'm going to change my amount and hit Save. And this time I was successful. And you can see in my funding that I've now funded $101,050 toward this activity. And once I've received this success message, I can do drawdowns for reimbursements as appropriate. For this particular activity, I would do this for this particular example, I would do this for the TBRA activity and for my 2 administration activities, for my project sponsor and for my grantee. But for brevity today, I'm just going to show you how to do that for the TBRA activity. And I'm going to hit Return without hitting my back browser. And we're going to go back to the presentation at this time. As a summary, I have set up 2 projects in IDIS, one for the grantee and one for the project sponsor. For the project sponsor, I set up 3 activities, TBRA, administration, and project sponsor reporting. For the grantee, I set up 2 activities, administration and grantee reporting. Now that projects and activities are set up and funds have been encumbered, you can draw down funds for those activities. Since there have been no changes in IDIS to the way that you create drawdown vouchers and approve them, we will not be demonstrating those features today. Instead, we are going to go straight to procedures to close out the accomplishment year. For all formula grantees, part of the enhancements include a transition from the paper-based paper to IDIS for performance reporting. Starting July 1st, 2012, all formula grantees were required to start implementing the new structure for setting up projects and activities in IDIS. If you are in the middle of your operating year, you do not need to go back and change how you structured your projects and activities in the system. You will report accomplishments using the paper-based paper. You will have to complete the accomplishment screens in IDIS, or the system will not allow you to complete your activities. But your primary means for reporting will be the paper caper. At the start of your new accomplishment year, you will implement this new structure, making any changes necessary to your internal structures. At the end of that year, you will complete both a paper caper and your IDIS performance screens. For many, this transition year will start during the 2012 year. This transition year will allow us to double-check your data entry for 1 year and to work toward eliminating any glitches in the new IDIS screens. This will complete your transition into IDIS. All future reporting after this full transition year will be done in IDIS only. Using our State of New Mexico example, I am going to demonstrate to you how to close out your activities. Okay, we're switching back to demonstration mode. And like your activity setup, you are going to start by entering your accomplishment screen for your direct services activities. And the reason is the same. Your project sponsor and grantee reporting activities will be pulling information that you have entered in your housing subsidy assistance activities. So you want to make sure to enter those first. I'm going to do that by under my Plans, Projects, and Activities tab, going to the left of my screen and hitting Search under Activity. And this is where it comes in handy to have your activity ID numbers. I'm going to hit HOPWA Program, and I'm going to start with the TBRA activity for my project sponsor. Entering in as much search criteria to narrow my search as possible. And when the results come up, I should see my TBRA activity. Under the column labeled Action, I'm going to hit Edit. So it's going to take me to the Edit Activity Navigation page. When the page is fully loaded, I am going to scroll down to my activity table, and you'll notice there's now a new column that's available labeled Accomplishments. I'm going to go down to HOPWA and hit Add Accomplishments. I'm going to double check my gray area to make sure I'm in the proper activity for the proper project sponsor. And I'm going to hit my accomplishment year, making sure it's the same one I established targets for. You'll see a question that says, Final Data for Annual Report, yes or no. This is how you will notify your HUD CPD representative that you have finished entering in all of your data. The final thing you will do when you've completed all of your accomplishment year data entry is change that from no to yes. So for now, I'm going to leave that at no. And here I would write in my accomplishment narrative. There are guidelines in your user manual. It would include information about outputs and outcomes, as well as successes and barriers, so you can consult your manual for guidelines around that. Now, in my setup detail, I was establishing targets. In my accomplishment detail, I am reporting the households that I actually served with TBRA throughout the year. The first line is the number of households. I was projecting to hit 30 households, so I'm going to say I served 35. All of your housing subsidy assistance activities will have a question similar to this one. Of the households served with HOPWA-funded TBRA or RA, how many also received HOPWA-funded case management services from this project sponsor during the operating year? And this is going to go to your Access to Care table. The system will use this information to determine the cohort of clients that you are reporting Access to Care outcomes on. This will be used to both to help you figure out which clients you're reporting on, and also for HUD to create a percentage for each grantee around how many clients had access to care. And just to show you how that works, I'm going to enter in a total here, even though in our example, this project sponsor has not been funded for HOPWA-funded case management. And I'm going to enter the total number of households served with leverage funds. And I'm going to scroll down, and this is the first of my outcomes that I would see. You should be familiar with this as part 4 of your current paper. IDIS has built into it what we call data checks. And these are areas where your outcomes must equal your input. So I said that I served 35 households with TBRA. I must indicate that a total of 35 households either continued in TBRA or exited. If I don't have a matching number, I'm going to get an error message, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I entered 40, knowing that's incorrect, and I get an error message. Total number of households that received TBRA must equal the total number of performance outcomes. There are a number of data checks throughout IDIS. Again, use your troubleshooting section in your manual to help you resolve them if you're confused. So I'm going to change this and say that 30 households continued and 5 exited to private housing. And the last data entry field has to do with expenditures. There's one field, total funds drawn to date, that will automatically populate from IDIS. It is going to list all of the funds drawn to date on this activity. Since your performance reporting is due 90 days after the end of your operating year, this could include funds that were drawn down in the next accomplishment year. So the only data entry is total funds expended for TBRA this program year. And that actually should read total funds expended for TBRA this accomplishment year. What you're actually being asked to provide is how much did you spend on TBRA during the 12-month operating year period. And I'm going to say $400,000 and hit save. And it's going to take a second, and it's going to take me back to my Edit Activity navigation page. And I've gotten my success message indicating that I saved successfully. Again, if you get an error message, consult your manual for help resolving it. And if I scroll down to my activity navigation table, you'll notice that I now have an additional column labeled completion check. And I'm going to hit that at the end of my year, and it's going to tell me whether I've completed all of the fields I need to close out this activity. So it's now checking all of my entries, and I have the HOPWA activity pathway is complete. At this point, I have two options. I can either close out this activity, and I would do that by changing the status to completed, and then under completion date, entering in the date that I closed the activity. Or, if my methodology for choosing program year allows me to set up a second accomplishment year using the same activity, I would do that at the start of the new accomplishment year, and let me show you how to do that. Under HOPWA, I would go to the column labeled Setup Detail and hit Edit HOPWA. And you'll notice at the top, I can save, and that's if I'm making any changes, cancel, delete program year, or add another year. So I'm going to hit that. And you'll notice I now have a blank screen with the same activity ID number. So I'm going to enter in another program year just to show you what it looks like. And I would enter in similar information around my budget targets and my household targets. Identifying or changing my subrecipients. The address is automatically populated, and I hit save. And I'm back to the Edit Activity page. Just to show you, once it finishes populating, what that looks like, if I went back to the column labeled Setup Detail and hit Edit HOPWA, when the screen pulls up, I now have the option to select more than one accomplishment year. So I now have two accomplishment year pathways set up for activity 8038. This will most often happen when you decide to use the earliest grant year funding activities as your method for determining program year. If the same grant year is the earliest grant year for multiple years, you can use this feature to use the same projects and activities for another year and to set up this second accomplishment year. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I've now set up my accomplishments for the TBRA activity. I need to do the same thing for my other two service activities, and those are the administration activities. So I'm going to finish out for my project sponsor by selecting my search criteria, and I know for my tracking sheet that it's activity number 8039, and I search. And when my results come up, I hit Edit under Action, and wait for the system to take me to the Edit Activity Navigation page. And when the system has fully loaded the page, I scroll down to my activity table. And again, I go to the column labeled Accomplishments and hit Add HOPWA Accomplishments. I check to make sure I'm in the right activity, enter my accomplishment year. Remember, I'm leaving final data for annual report at no until I've done entering everything. I enter in my narrative, consulting my manual for what I should put in there. And for administration, the only accomplishment that you need to report are the actual funds you spent on administration during the year. And remember, program year should say accomplishment year. So I set my budget target at the beginning of the year, and I set my budget actual expenditures at the end of the year. Again, this is all information you would normally be reporting in your paper-based CAPER in Part 3, Table 1. I've hit save. I'm waiting to get my success message and for the page to finish loading. I'm going to scroll down to my activity table and hit check HOPWA pathway to make sure that I've successfully completed everything. And once I get my success message, if I'm closing out my activities at the same time I'm setting up my new activity, I would have to make a decision about whether to close this activity or to set up a second accomplishment year. For now, I'm now going to enter my accomplishments for the grantee administration activity. I do that by going to the activity on the left side of my screen and hitting search. HOPWA, selecting my search criteria, and again, because I've tracked it, I know that it's activity 8042, and hit search, or 804, I apologize, it's 8040. There we go. And now I have checked that it's my administration activity. Under action, I hit edit. And wait for the page to load. And I'm at my Edit Activity Navigation page. As a side note, this page is common for all your CPD programs, so you should be very familiar with this if you have more than one type of entitlement grant. And under the column Accomplishments, I'm going to hit Add HOPWA Accomplishments and wait for the page to load. Checking my gray area that I'm in the correct activity, I enter my accomplishment year, leaving final data for annual report at no until the end, using my accomplishment narrative. Because this is the narrative for the grantee, you want to be sure to enter in any jurisdiction-wide information that you would normally enter in your paper. And again, the only data entry is how much I actually spent on grantee administration during the accomplishment year. And I hit save. And I'm waiting for my success message and to be taken back to the Edit Activity Navigation page. Once the page is fully loaded, I can scroll down and again hit my Check HOPWA Pathway button to make sure that I've successfully completed my accomplishment year. Once this is done, I've now completed my accomplishment screens for all of my direct services activities. And like my setup screens, the next thing I need to do are my project sponsor reporting accomplishment pages. And I'm going to do that. So my pathway is complete, so I'm going to go to my project sponsor reporting by going to the left side of my page and hitting search under activity and entering in my search criteria. And this is activity 8041. And once it comes up, I'm going to hit edit under action and wait for the edit activity page to come up. Once the page is fully loaded, I scroll down to the activity table. And under accomplishments, I hit Add HOPWA Accomplishments. And I'm going to check my gray area to make sure that it's the appropriate activity. And like the setup screens, I need to enter an accomplishment year and save it before the additional questions will populate. And now you notice the additional questions are up. So the first is, of course, final data for annual report and my accomplishment narrative. And now I have a table that looks very similar to my adjustment for duplication under goals. However, this time I'm actually adjusting for duplication for households that were actually served. And you'll see that it's automatically populated again with the information that I entered under my TBRA activity accomplishment screen. It will pull over all housing subsidy assistance accomplishment screens that have been entered for this particular project sponsor. And again, the data entry field is how many households did the same project sponsor serve with housing subsidy assistance during the year? So using our same example, if they served 35 households with TBRA and they served 5 households with permanent housing placement, I would enter that information here. And it automatically gives me an unduplicated households actually served by this project sponsor. The next table should look familiar. It's part 2 of your CAPER, and this is actually leveraged funding. And this is where you're going to list all of the leveraged funding across different types of activities that this project sponsor received during the year. So I could say they got $25,000 for Ryan White case management. And when I click off of it, you'll notice the total at the bottom has been automatically populated. For each type of leveraged funding, whether it's public or private, you've been given a button where you can add additional lines. The ones that are provided are the most common, but not necessarily the only leveraged fund the project sponsor might have received. At the bottom of this page, you'll see resident rent payments. You are meant to enter the client portion of rent for TBRA here. So in this case, I might say that the clients paid $50,000 to their private landlords as part of the TBRA program. The next section is program income and resident rent payments collected. This would be any program income collected by the project sponsor. That could be, for example, deposit money that's returned to the organization after it's been reimbursed. It would also include resident rent payments made directly to the HOPWA program. And this is most likely to occur in a facility-based housing subsidy assistance program funded by HOPWA. The next is your program income and resident rent payment expended. So you would list of the program income that you collected, how much did you expend on the HOPWA program. And the last is getting us closer to that cohort number for access to care. And you'll notice at the top of the page, I indicated that I served a total of 35 households with HOPWA assistance during the year. And you'll remember in my TBRA activity, I indicated that I had served 5 with the same project sponsor with HOPWA-funded case management dollars. What this table did was take that 5 and subtract it from my 35 total to give me households served in 2 columns. The first is the number of households that received housing subsidy assistance only. So of my 35 households, 30 received only TBRA. And the second is the number of households that received housing subsidy assistance with HOPWA-funded case management, and that's the 5 households that I indicated received housing case management in my TBRA activity. The data field here is the adjustment for duplication for households that received more than one type of housing subsidy assistance from the project sponsor. Between these 2 categories, I should have listed my 5 households that I indicated were duplicated. And these are discrete numbers. So of my 30 households that received only housing subsidy assistance, I can say 3 had a duplication. And of my households that received both types of services, I had 2 that had duplication. So between the 2 columns, I should have 30 households totaling my 30 households reported up here. For project sponsor reporting, this is the last data entry field. So I'm going to hit save. And wait for it to take me back to the edit activity page and to get my success message. This is one page where you might encounter some data checks, And again, I would refer you back to your manual if you have trouble resolving them, especially around that access to care total number, the last table on that page. I know that can be confusing. So now I've entered in my accomplishment screens for project sponsor reporting. I've gotten my success message. The last thing I need to do to close out my accomplishment year is to enter my accomplishments for my grantee reporting. So I'm going to go back to the left side of my page, and under activity, I'm going to hit search. And I'm going to enter in my search criteria. And I know that this is activity 8042. So I hit search. Once my results have come up, I hit edit under the column labeled action and wait for it to take me to the edit activity navigation page. And when the page is finished loading, I'm going to scroll down to my activity table. And in the row labeled HOPWA, in the column for accomplishments, I hit Add HOPWA Accomplishments. I make sure my gray area is correct, enter in my accomplishment years, and hit Save. And again, additional questions will populate. This table actually includes a lot of your aggregate information from Part 7 of your paper. And it's one of the pages that's currently experiencing some glitches, and I'll explain them to you as we go along. I'm going to leave final data for annual report at no. I would enter in my accomplishment data. And you'll see a table labeled Housing Subsidy Assistance Actual Goal Adjustment for Duplication. What this table is meant to do in the first line is bring over your unduplicated totals that you determined in all of your project sponsor reporting activities. So it should say at this point 30 cents adjustment for duplication between project sponsors. If your system does not have the capability of tracking duplication between project sponsors, you can leave that blank. If you do have the capability, you would enter the number here. And even though it's not populating the total correctly, you can still enter the adjustment for duplication. It will allow you to enter that negative number. And the same thing from the supportive services. Under all of the supportive services activity pages, it should be pulling over everything that's been entered under supportive services. And again, you can enter your adjustment for duplication. Here you're going to enter your sources of leveraging for the grantee. And just a side note, if you are a grantee that also does direct services, you would leave the sources of leveraging blank under your project sponsor reporting activity and report all of your leveraging in your grantee reporting. So again, I can enter numbers here. Using the Add Other Public and Add Other Private to enter anything that doesn't appear already populated. I would enter my program income collected and expended for the grantee. And then you'll see new questions. This is all of the information that you currently report in Part 7 of your paper. There are many data checks in this section, so consult your manual if you have problems. The first is the number of persons who qualified the household for subsidy assistance, so that was 30. The next is the number of all other persons diagnosed as HIV positive. So this was added as a comment from grantees. However, I would like to make it clear that you are not required to get HIV verification from beneficiaries in the household. This field is provided only if you happen to know that there's a positive partner or child living in the household. You do not need to ask the question if you do not know, and you do not need verification for beneficiaries. However, if the partner is also a client of your agency, you could add that there. The last line, all other persons without HIV, is where you enter benefiting family members who are either diagnosed as HIV negative or who you do not have HIV verification on. So I'm going to say there were 10 beneficiaries for a total of 40. The next is my prior living situation table, and this should look familiar to you. There is a data check here. The number of prior living situations that you enter needs to equal the persons who qualified the household for housing subsidy assistance. So I need to have 30 entered here. I'm going to say that 20 continued from the previous operating year, 5 came from an emergency shelter, and 5 had a rented room. And you'll see at the bottom it entered total. So I've now got my 30 households. Number 5 is just totaling the total number of households that came from a homeless situation. So it totals rows 2 through 4. The next is my homeless individual summary table, and this is the only table where there's actually a new data entry field that is not in your paper, and it's the last one. Of the total number of HOPWA eligible individuals served with housing subsidy, the number who are homeless with children under the age of 18. This was added for 2 reasons. One, to be more in line with HMIS for those of you who have to report both in HMIS and in IDIS. But also because the HOPWA program is trying to get a better idea of clients that enter into the program from a homeless situation and what their family structure looks like. HUD understands that you probably don't have a mechanism to collect this right now. It is not currently a required field. However, HUD does ask that you add that to your data collection systems, and then you should be able to report it in the next year or so. This is also another table where there's a glitch. The data check should be that you cannot enter more households on any line as homeless than you reported as coming from homelessness above in prior living situation. So I should not be able to enter more than 5 for any of these lines. However, it's currently only letting me enter 5 total between the lines. HUD is aware of this, and it's slated to be fixed. However, if you have a number that you cannot report here, please report it in your narrative. Your age and gender and race and ethnicity data check back to the total beneficiary number. In this case, it would be 40. So between my HOPWA eligible individuals and my all other beneficiaries, I should have 40 age and gender count totals combined. You also now have the ability to enter and identify transgender individuals. And for brevity, I'm just going to enter everybody here. The same with your race and ethnicity. The total between HOPWA eligible individuals and all other beneficiaries should equal 40. Your ethnicity columns are a subset, so the only data check is that it can't be more than your total. Your area median income for households, and again, this should data check back to the number of households that I served. And now I'm to access to care. And this first table is where I finally get to my total number of households that I should be reporting access to care on. And it's pulling from all of my housing subsidy assistance and project sponsor reporting activities. So it's not calculating correctly, but at this point it should say households that received housing subsidy only. Remember, I had 30 under my project sponsor reporting and 5 for case management. And my only data field is the adjustment for duplication between project sponsors. And if there is no adjustment for duplication between project sponsors, I would leave that blank. And so in this case, I have 30 households I should be reporting access to care on. So I'm going to enter those here. And the last field under grantee reporting is households that obtained employment as a result of a job training or case management program. And since I didn't have that in this example, I'm going to leave that blank and hit save. And at this point, if there's a data check error, I would get an error message at the top of the screen. And I got a success message. So Now that concludes how I do my accomplishment screens, and I would have to make a choice at this point as to whether to close out my activities or to add another accomplishment year. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation. This slide sums up some of the demonstration points we discussed. Remember, grant year is applied when you want to encumber funds to a specific activity. When you encumber funds to an activity, you will indicate which grant year or grant years you want to use to fund the service. IDIS uses program year to identify projects and activities. Part of the new guidance indicates that the grantee must choose one program year to identify with all projects and activities for the 12-month accomplishment year. To help you determine what program year to use, there are several methodologies listed in your manual from which you can choose. These options are also detailed in your transition tool provided as Appendix B. First, if as the grantee, you generally use a single grant year to fund activities, the grant year and the program year may be the same. But if you tend to fund activities for your project sponsors using multiple grant years, you can use one of several options. The important thing is to choose one methodology and use it consistently from year to year. First, if the bulk of your activities will be funded from a single grant year, you may align your program year with that grant year. Or you may decide to use the earliest grant year funding activities as the program year. Remember, this may be helpful if you plan to set up multi-year contracts with your project sponsors using the same grant year. In this example, you may end up setting up multiple accomplishment years within your activities. Finally, if you have a logical sequence that has worked for you over the history of your formula grant, you may use the next logical program year in that sequence. When you set up an activity, you will be asked to assign an accomplishment year. Remember, this is the 12-month period for which you will be implementing services according to your consolidated plan. Remember, if you plan to use the same program year for all of your projects and activities for 2 or more accomplishment years, you can use the same activities by setting up a new accomplishment year within the activities. One of the great things about the enhancement in IDIS is that it does establish a consistent structure for data entry in IDIS for the HOPWA program. In the long term, this will allow you to integrate consolidated planning and performance reporting for better planning, and as I said, will eliminate paper reporting. Also, it will allow HUD to have a national standard by which to monitor HOPWA grantees in IDIS. In the short term, however, this means that some grantees will have to make changes. As part of the manual, HUD included a transition tool to help you conceptualize what changes you may need to make and to successfully implement those changes. I want to quickly review this tool with you. Also, at the end of this presentation, there is a list of technical assistance resources that are available to you, including my contact information. The transition tool is separated into 5 tasks, each with specific action steps. The first task is to identify and close out any obsolete activities that may exist in the system. These would be activities that you're no longer funding services with. To do this, you can use the PRO2 MicroStrategy report. If you are unfamiliar with using MicroStrategy reports, there is a link on the technical assistance page of this presentation to an entire manual for users who want to learn about MicroStrategy. Task 2 is to complete your current accomplishment year using whatever structure you currently have in place. This is considered part of your transitional reporting in that you will have to complete accomplishment screens in IDIS in order to close out your activities, and you will also have to complete a paper-based paper report. Task 3 is to prepare for the transition by identifying what changes you will need to make to accommodate the new structural requirements for HOPWA in IDIS, and then create a plan internally for implementing those changes. Note that this may mean changing the way you internally link your invoicing to projects and activities in IDIS. For example, one grantee I spoke with had historically created separate administration activities for each HOPWA service that a project sponsor agency was funded to provide. So an agency with TDRA, StrumU, and supportive services had 3 separate administration activities associated with it. In the new structure, this grantee can only create one administration activity for the project sponsor agency. This grantee will still be able to set up contracts and track administration activities separately within their own agency, but will need to have a mechanism in place to link these expenditures to the one administration activity in IDIS. Task 4 is to implement any structural changes necessary to implement the IDIS structure I have outlined for you today. The tool itself will highlight some decisions you will need to make around choosing a program year and naming your projects and activities. And finally, Task 5 is to close out your performance year, completing performance reporting using the new structure in IDIS. This concludes the informational portion of this webinar. This page is provided simply to list additional technical assistance resources available for you. This page also appears in your manual. The Technical Assistance Unit, or TAU, will act as your general help desk. If you find a glitch in the system, you will report it to the TAU. If you are not sure how to do something in IDIS, you can also contact the TAU. You will see a separate number to call if you need to reset your IDIS password. And finally, at the bottom of the screen, you will see additional manuals on IDIS that you can download, including the MicroStrategy manual I mentioned earlier. Provided here is my contact information. Please feel free to email or call me with questions. Thank you for your participation, and we hope this helps you to better understand the new IDIS structure. This concludes the